Welcome back. Let's talk a little bit today about the next step in my game. I realize that I do have a setting video that does mention my races. So I think, need to talk about them from a mechanics perspective, but I'm going to do it a little bit more quickly, and I'm going to talk a little bit about how I changed my original incarnation. So this is interesting. I think a lot of people may find this an unusual step to take. I have decided that any campaign I would ever start, you are only allowed to select human as your race because the setting is primarily humanocentric. And my races, which are demi-humans that are really kind of different than what, your bog standard fantasy races. They're not elves and dwarves and hobbits and crap like that. I've got, pretty new and unique stuff where they were human, but they've been cursed or had some kind of supernatural admixture or something that has turned them into human, but also not human. So I've decided that you have to start as human, and you can't select another race until you've had the chance to become sufficiently acquainted with that race in game to make it so that you could effectively play one of these races. I've also decided to trim down my selection of races, and I didn't remove anything, but I did remove them from the main game. So I have about half my races that are kind of up in the front, and I have another half of my races, some of which were originally races that were normally selectable. They are now in the appendix, depending on the game and who's running it. Even me in maybe some other campaign, they would all be selectable. But I kind of want to separate the appendix races from the main races just to kind of separate them and give them a little bit of the sense that, they're really not commonly going to be seen as PC races, and you really shouldn't expect to see them as PC races. In fact, you really shouldn't expect to see them except in kind of unusual circumstances pretty much anywhere. And so a lot of these races, they're either going to be in disguise, hiding their nature, or they're going to be very unusual, or they, simply only, are in small and limited areas. If they just wander around into any regular small town, people would look at them like, what the heck are you supposed to be? And it would be kind of an interesting situation, but it would also get old after a while because who wants to role play that out over and over again every time you go anywhere? But at the same time, I don't want to remove that aspect from the game. I don't want to take away the idea that, these races should be unusual, or they're really, even though I originally made them as PC races, in many ways, some of them really aren't meant to be PCs in a way. And then they could be in certain games in my setting, but also they would not be in most games. Anyway, let's go on to the races that I have. The first race, as I mentioned, is human. Everybody kind of knows what a human is. I don't have just every single ethnicity of human either. My setting is deliberately meant to evoke a very limited subset of Earth human cultures that are kind of transposed into this fantasy setting. So, basically I have the hillmen, which are kind of like Robin Hood era Englishmen, except on the American frontier. So, they're in a different social and cultural context, but from a technological and, and some other aspects of their social context, that's who they are. They're the Robin Hood era British. And, in Ivanhoe, they mentioned, several races as being part of the British, the Saxons, the Normans, the Celts, and the Danes. I expect that if you really want to get that granular, you could also do the same thing with the hillmen. There would be some that kind of have, Viking-ish names and maybe some Viking-ish ancestry. There would be, some Anglo-Saxons. A lot of the higher class and richer people might have Frenchish names because they're like Normans. And then there could be a bunch of Scottish people on the frontier as well, or other Celtic people. But that's probably more detail than you need. There's a few other peoples who are also, they're not hillmen, they're like the people of Timishburg, who are kind of like Austrians with an Austrian overclass over kind of a Balkan, Romanian or Slavic, lower class. And then there's, of course, the Drylanders up in the third of the three realms. We're not going to get to those for a long time. They're kind of like Cossacks, I imagine. They live in the wilderness. They ride around. They're kind of raiders. I don't want to get too much into those because the hill country is the first campaign, and that's where I've done the most work. So we'll leave the other human races right there for now. The next race are the gray men, or Hyperboreans. They are, well, as their name suggests, they're gray. Their skin is gray, their hair is white, their eyes are white. They speak in kind of a raspy whisper in a way. They just are completely kind of colorless. And they are the descendants of ancient Hyperborea, which in my world is very similar to the North Country of some of Lovecraft's old sword and sorcery. So the city-state that they are mostly found in now is called Lomar. There's two different populations that came from two different city-states, the Zobnans and the Nixians, that both live in Lomar. And as you get into one of the campaigns, it talks a bit about the difference between them. There's actually another smaller population in Timishburg near the town of Inganok, and they're kind of onyx miners. Again, very Lovecraft influenced, as you can see. Mechanically, they're a little different than humans. Humans have a +1 to all skills. The gray men have an affinity for stealth, which means that if they're doing a stealth-related check, they kind of automatically have advantage on it. They get to roll 2d20s and pick the better of the two. They also have a +1 to all athletics and knowledge skill checks. The searchers are next. I originally thought of them as kind of like the fire genasi from Dungeons and Dragons, and physically that's still very much what they would look like. They kind of have a brick red skin, orange red or yellow hair that often kind of stands up in waves and is usually kind of fine, bright yellow or occasionally orange eyes. And I gave them originally kind of an Arabian Nights-like culture. As they've migrated from some of my older versions of the setting into the Dark Fantasy X setting. They actually are no longer like that. They come from the far north, from an Iceland-like place where there's volcanoes and stuff like that, and that's why they're called Surters, because it's to kind of imply their northern nature. I actually envision them as kind of like hot-headed red men from Barsoom in terms of their personality and culture. However, in the setting itself, in the three realms, I mean, they kind of come from outside of the setting, beyond the bounds of what I'm going to explore or detail. And because of that, they here within the setting themselves, they're kind of like expatriates and exiles in a way. They're kind of cut off from their main political and cultural group. They have, like humans, they have a +1 to some skills. It's not all skills, though. It's only to any 2 skills. And they have a fiery attack where once a day they can add 2d6 fire damage for 3 turns to their attacks. They make their sword catch on fire or whatever. Kemlings are the next race. They are black-skinned. And I don't mean like, Africans. I mean like they're like obsidian black, or occasionally, if they're not quite that dark, they're like a sooty gray skinned color. And they have yellow eyes. They have kind of a little ring of horns around their head, kind of like Darth Maul. If you imagine them as looking sort of like the Demon Lord Grazit, except with normal legs and normal size and no tail, that's what I think of them. Or you could also imagine them as being, what if Darth Maul and Nightcrawler from the X-Men had a baby? Their ancestry or their curse or whatever comes from some demon taint, and they kind of look like it. They used to have empires that stretched across much of the area of the 3 realms. Today, they are mostly from one of the 3 realms, which used to be kind of the center of their empire, but their empire's fallen apart, and it is now a broken mishmash of city-states. There's kind of been a diaspora of these guys because as their homeland fell into chaos, a lot of them kind of took off and left. They also run some organized crime in some of the other cities, and of course they also have just normal people doing normal stuff. They get a +1 to their dex stat, and they have a racial affinity for stealth. So like the gray men, they can get advantage on stealth checks. And they have the ability to see in the dark somewhat. It's kind of like a biological equivalent to night vision goggles. So it's not like dark vision. If there's no light, they can't see. But if there's some light, they can see better than anybody else, like if you put night vision goggles on. The final race, as part of the normal races, is the Wood Woses. This is actually the name. A lot of people are familiar with it because Tolkien had the Woses, but he actually took that from some medieval stuff, and Wood Wose is usually the full name. In my setting, Wood Woses are people who are cursed with a form of werewolfism, lycanthropy, I suppose. However, it's a much weaker than, they're not full-blown werewolves. They're kind of like just savage, slightly animalistic people, but they're not necessarily primitive. They prefer to live out in the wilderness. They get kind of antsy if they're tied down for too long. They don't do super well in cities, although some of them are hired muscle for some of the mafia and organized crime. But mostly they live in kind of in tribal clusters out in the woods, far away from everybody else. And there's enough of them that come and go that people are familiar with them. They're not quite as exotic as the races that ended up moving to the appendix, but they're certainly much more rare in the bigger cities. Now, I don't mean to imply that because they're savage that they're not like orcs. They're not bad guy races. I mean, orcs as they are typically portrayed in fantasy, they're not a bad guy race. These are just they're normal people with some unusual abilities and an affinity for the wilderness. They gain +2 to strength, +1 to the bushcraft skill, but a -1 to their communication, knowledge, and tinker skills. They, like I said, they're not primitive like the Wendax are, where they literally are cursed to not be able to use anything more advanced than Stone Age technology without sickening and dying. But they don't really value quote unquote high civilization the same as a lot of other races. So anyway, I was going to talk a lot more, but this is taking longer than I thought. I think I'm going to end this video here, and I'm going to do the appendix races in another video, and then I've got the next stage after that is my feats. And just as to give you a little preview of coming attractions, the feats used to all be class abilities, and I used to have classes, but I had rules where you could tinker with the classes, you could mix and match abilities. I finally kind of went all the way and decided, if I'm doing that, why even have classes at all? How about just take all the class abilities out, make them kind of a la carte abilities that you can pick, and rather than call them class abilities, call them something else. And the word I came up with feats, I know feats maybe has some baggage because of 3rd edition, 4th edition, 5th edition, but they're really nothing like those feats. These are really class abilities that have been decoupled from specific classes, and you can kind of build your own class out of them. So we'll talk about that after I get done with the appendix races, and I think I'm going to spend less time on the appendix races, move a little faster through them, and talk about the feats. And then if I still have time, I'll talk about hit points at 2 after that. Anyway, that'll end it for now. Let's talk later when I've got the next video ready to go.